Hello, my name is Zehra Gümüşok. I'm a first-year industrial engineering student at Bilkent University, and this is my Physics 101 laboratory project. My project's name is Investigation of Factors Affecting the Period of the Pendulum. So in my experiments, the variables on which the period of the pendulum depends will be examined, and I will calculate the period by changing the mass of the object, the length of the pendulum, and the releasing angles. And equipment required for my experiments are a pendulum setup, a ruler, 20-gram object, 50-gram object, 100-gram object, a camera for recording my video, a stopwatch, and a software editing app for editing my video. And my experiment will basically include three parts. In the first stage of my experiment, I measured the period by changing the pendulum's releasing angles. First, I measured the length of the pendulum with a ruler. I obtained it as 0.36 meters. Then I set up the pendulum mechanism with an object of 50 grams. I set the pendulum swing angle to 10 degrees. I measured the period as 1.20 seconds with a stopwatch. Secondly, I increased the releasing angle to 15 degrees, keeping the pendulum length and mass constant. I measured the period as 1.25 seconds with a stopwatch. Then thirdly, I increased the pendulum angle to 30 degrees, again keeping all values constant, and measured the period as 1.40 seconds with a stopwatch. And in my second experiment, I observed the period of the pendulum by changing the masses of the objects. I set the length of the pendulum as, again, 36 centimeter, which is 0.36 meters, and I set the releasing angle of the pendulum remained the same in all of my experiments. And first, I connected the 20-gram object to the mechanism. I measured the period as 1.4 seconds with a stopwatch. Secondly, I set up the mechanism by keeping the angle and length variables constant with a 100-gram object this time. I measured the period as 1.38 seconds with a stopwatch. Finally, I measured the period of the 50-gram object as 1.4 seconds. Then in my third experiment, I set the releasing angle to 40 degrees with a 100-gram object. I measured the change in period by changing the length of the pendulum and again keeping other variables constant. First, I measured the period as 1.38 with a 36 centimeter long rope. Secondly, I made the length of the rope to 24 centimeters and measured the period as 1 second. Finally, I reduced the length of the pendulum to 19 centimeter and measured the period as 0.8 seconds. There might be some errors in my experiments since I ignored air resistance, and there might have been errors occurred due to my measurement mistakes. As a result, in my first experiment, I observed that the period increased as the pendulum swing angle increased at large angles exceeding 15 degrees. And in my second experiment, when I increased the mass, I observed that the period remains all the same. And finally, based on the formula, I observed that it increased depending on the pendulum length.